We're live.
Hey everyone, we are here this evening for a special conversation, I guess you could say, to talk about the passing of Toni Morrison. I asked David if he would be willing to go live with us just to share his thoughts. And I also wanted to reflect a bit too, because like many of you, I know I've been really sad with Toni Morrison's passing, but also really grateful. Yeah. And when I thought about folks that I wanted to have a conversation with, of course, David Malebranche, my partner in crime, came to mind just because I think we first met many years ago. Right. We talked about Toni. I don't know how it came up. So, David, do you want to, maybe we should just start with your having taken a class with Toni Morrison at Princeton. Would you mind sharing?
Yeah. I can, I went to Princeton from 1986 to 1990, right? And I had read The Bluest Eye before. I'd read Sula before for some of my classes, and then I read Song of Solomon, which completely blew me away. And there were a lot of father-son dynamics between Milkman Dead and his father that kind of resonated with me. And I remember actually being the only black student in that class and I started crying as I was summarizing like my thoughts about it. And like the instructor had to console me afterwards because I was crying so hard about some of the themes that had kind of come up through the book. And I remember not always fully thinking that I had grasped Toni Morrison's style, because it was always very lyrical, very layered. Mm-hmm. And some of the complaints about Toni Morrison's novel was that you had to go back and read it a couple of times. And that was my first introduction. Toni Morrison actually joined the Princeton faculty between my junior and senior years. And I'm trying to remember whether it was the fall of my senior year or the spring of my senior year, but there was a class that she did called Art and Culture in it was called Afro-American Literature back then, where she featured some of her novels as well as the works of Toni Cade Bambara and other prominent black authors at the time. And you had to apply, actually, you had to go through an application process to get into the seminar, and there were 12 of us in the seminar. And we would sit down and we'd read books every week and then we'd discuss them. And the most amazing thing about it was, one, I mean, she was just brilliant. And then I think for me, like I may not remember a lot of other details about it, I mean, because it was 30 years ago. But I do remember when we had to read Beloved, which she had just written, I think 2 years prior, I think it was 87 that Beloved came out. And she read from Beloved, and she read the chapter where the ghost finally speaks, and it starts with "I am beloved and she is mine," and I get goosebumps whenever I say that, because I remember her speaking it, and I remember the 12 of us sitting in that room, and you could have heard a pin drop, and just hearing Toni Morrison's voice reading, and it was a short chapter if you remember from the book, but reading the ghost as the ghost was speaking, with the intonation, with the inflection that was meant to have from the ghost, was an experience I'll never forget. And it's something that I always rub in the faces of like friends of mine who are writers and who are really snobby about writing. I was like, well, when did you take a class with Toni Morrison and hear her read from Beloved? I was like, oh, never? Okay, all right, that was me. But she was absolutely amazing. And so that was my first recollection. I can tell the story. You want me to tell the story about the other stuff a little bit later on, or right now?
We're just flowing.
Okay, so, yeah, go ahead. I want you to speak a little bit.
Well, we share Song of Solomon. That's also my favorite Toni Morrison novel. And it was really the first novel I read that made me love literature and love demanding literature. I think before then I had only read not, terribly serious books or not very demanding books. So I was, I think, a junior in high school here in Atlanta. And one of the things I loved about growing up in Atlanta and being a graduate of the Atlanta Public Schools is that, or at least the school I went to, which is that, black literature was a part of the curriculum. It's so strange when I talk to folks that never really read black authors in high school, even people my age or whatever. And I mean, we, had in our AP English and 11th grade reading list, we had like several black authors, and Toni Morrison was one of them, so we had to do a book report, and I just randomly picked Song of Solomon. I don't know why I just picked it.
I had no idea.
I think maybe I don't even remember what made me pick that book. And I started reading it, and I was struggling with it. And I was like, these names, Milkman and Making Dead, and
guitar.
I couldn't really. But then I think I was just reading it, and just on my push through. And at a certain point, I think it was probably around. I think it was I can't remember the exact part, but at a certain point, maybe midway through, it just started coming together for me as she started describing the whole flight and where the names came from, and how they're, you know, a milkman having this sort of shame around his name. I think just explaining, so as the parts started to, the different threads started to come together,
Right.
and just the magic of that, and really appreciating the challenge of reading something that not only, you know, is very intellectually demanding, but just the beauty of the language, and
Oh my
that,
God.
and that language could do that, and
Right.
it changed me forever. And then I read Beloved, and I just went on and just started reading all her novels. But I did have a question for you. So, was part of your affinity for Song of Solomon, was it also with Macon Dead being a doctor, and that, or the, not Macon Dead being a doctor, but the mother, his wife, being the daughter of a doctor, and
Yeah, and my father's a physician. I wasn't a physician
son
yet
of a
either,
doctor.
so there were a lot of like things that were resonating with me, and I think that was part of it as well. So it really kind of captured, and I was having a lot of struggles with my dad at the time.
Oh, yeah.
So like the tension between Milkman Dead and his father was, you know, on display that whole time, and how different they were, and then the concepts of flight and kind of what that meant and what that symbolized. One of the things that really struck me about Song of Solomon was bringing in the character of Guitar, and Milkman Dead, who kind of played it safe a lot of times and just kind of went along the way he did, and then Guitar, who was kind of like this rebel, and the whole concept of the 7 days.
The 7 days, exactly.
And
I think about that a lot.
And so for those of you who haven't read Song of Solomon, it's not really a huge spoiler, but there's a concept called the 7 days
Yep.
that Milkman Dead's friend Guitar was a part
Kind
of.
of like a secret society.
It was
too,
a
in
secret.
way.
It was a secret society of 7 black men that each were assigned to a different day of the week.
Yeah.
And so what they were doing back then was that if somebody committed some heinous, racist, atrocious act, like supposing a 6-year-old black girl
Was lynched on a
lynched on a Monday, and your day was Monday.
Monday.
You were supposed to lynch a 6-year-old white girl. Like it was the equivalent of that. And so, to me, I remember reading about that, and it was revolutionary because I think at that time in the late '80s, and I think the book was Song of Solomon was written in the '70s.
It's like 79 or something. Or
Yeah,
78.
and so
maybe 77, I think.
Yeah, and so to me, you know, you think about that, and we had a much more passive approach. And I mean, already Martin Luther King had been assassinated, Malcolm X had been assassinated, but this whole notion of like an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, which I still think actually carries over to today because we don't actually do that. And so you think about the times that we're in today and the passivity with dealing with a lot of the isms that we go through today. I've always been a firm believer that people will not commit some of the atrocities if you smack them in the mouth the same way that they're doing, or something happens to them or a member of their family or a member of their community in the same heinous way it was done to ours. And so I remember becoming very inspired by that and just her writing. And I know she wrote it, and I think if I remember reading an interview with her, she actually said that she had done some research, and there was something like that. So it wasn't completely fictional. But Toni Morrison, and actually coming from the class, she was very clear that she always researched. Like she did mounds of research about history, going to the locations where she was going to write about. And so her novels were works of fiction, but they were steeply based in fact-based realities of those time periods that she traveled to. And that's, to me, what I thought. And it layers on top of both how she played with language, the lyrical quality, the musical quality of her words and how she played with words, and then also the historical backing of it up. So to me, when people say she's one of the greatest Black American authors of our time, I was like, she's one of the greatest American authors of all time. And so if you look at her body of work, it's just phenomenal to see the way she layered all those things and the amount of work it would take. And she wrote her first book when she was, 39?
Yeah.
So she started older. So those of you that are watching and don't understand that Toni Morrison did not write that first book until she was almost 40. So some people think, well, I'm 30 now, I'm mid-30s, I can't change my direction or change my career. Yes, you can. And she did it and became one of the best authors of our times.
You know, and there are those of us that definitely love Toni Morrison, the writer, the force that she was in literature. But it's been amazing watching people post some of her interviews particularly the one, I think she's on Charlie Rose, and she's describing how, like, what does it mean for someone to only be tall if someone else is kneeling? Like, and she's just fierce in this interview, and she's just, she's a performer, essentially. She's a theater minor at Howard, too, I think.
Right.
So she also, has her persona, I think, in the world is just also really inspiring. And, I just, if I could ever give an interview like that where I'm just fearless.
Yeah, and we were talking about this last night at dinner, actually. Went out with some friends to have dinner, celebrate a friend's birthday, and he mentioned that Charlie Rose interview.
Yeah.
But the other interview that I saw was one, and it was with a British white female reporter. And she asked her the question, I don't know if you've seen this video, but she said, you'll remember it, but she said, do you think you'll ever write about white characters or write white characters in your novels? And she said, I have. She said, no, I don't mean by that. I mean, to the extent that you would, write in a fully fleshed white character. And she said, I want to break down how racist that question is you just asked me. And then she proceeded to tear this woman a new asshole and basically said, you would never ask a prominent white writer, or you would never ask Woody Allen, why doesn't he direct more black actors?
Or Tolstoy.
Yeah, you would
or
never ask
Chekhov
these
or
famous
these,
authors to do this. So
Faulkner,
why do you think it's okay to ask me? And that very question in and of itself is racist. And when I tell you that white reporter looked shook, she was shook. And the crazy thing about it was that Toni said it with not an ounce of anger in her voice. She said it, and she was almost like playful with it, like, oh, dearie. Like, oh, it was almost condescending, like, do you understand, like, how racist your question is? And then just cut her to shreds.
She always likes to play with her food.
Right, and then just send her packing. And it was just hysterical. But I think it speaks to...
And she got asked that question again and again. I'm sure she got tired of asking it, like, why don't you censor white people in your writing? And she was not here for it.
She didn't
She
care.
does not center white people. And I think that was such a bold and radical, just to write about oneself, And
for an author to actually do that. And
I think about that a lot, like how to, because, the white gaze, and not just for artists, but I think for all of us can be crushing. I mean, so many of us are crushed under the white gaze trying to write or act or behave or practice medicine, like whatever.
And explain things for
explain
white people.
To explain things to the white people. And of
Right.
course, there's, I think, a lot of incentives that people sometimes find
Financial.
when they build their lives around explaining to white folks. And I know for me and I've always carried that, even as a organizer and as an advocate, I've always carried that I don't do my work. I don't center whiteness in my work.
Right.
I wasn't chosen by white people to be a leader. I was chosen by
Right.
black people.
Right.
How has that functioned?
Yeah, I mean, I think the same thing. I've never, in research that I've done, a lot of people will talk about when
research,
we do research, it's hysterical because
Yeah.
I've always been a proponent of, I'm going to research black men, or specifically black same-gender loving men. And people say, well, why don't you compare white men and black men? And I was like, we don't need a reference group by which we're compared. And so research with black gay men or black same-gender loving men should stand on its own. And so why do we always have to compare ourselves to another group? And I think Toni kind of set the table for us to be very unapologetic about that. And so I'm always blessed. I do want to tell the story about the classmate.
Oh, absolutely.
Okay, so I have to tell the story about Toni Morrison, and just to celebrate kind of how...
And for folks that are joining us, David took a course when he was in undergrad with Toni Morrison at Princeton.
Yeah, and this was like 30 years ago. And it was actually her first class
Oh
that she taught. So she was kind of nervous about it as well, but I guess she was 58 at the time, because she passed it, she was 88. So we had a seminar of 12 of us, and it was mostly black folks. I think we had one white girl who was in it, who, whenever we brought up, and we would read books every week, and then we'd all, bring our analysis to it, bring a discussion to it at this seminar, and it was like, I think, an hour and a half or 2 hours. And there was one white girl that would always bring up that she didn't understand, and she didn't this, and so she was always the contrarian with everything. And we always used to get flustered with her. And then one day, Toni came in, and she was upset, and we were like, what's going on? She was a little bit flustered, and she was like, I just saw this stupid-ass movie called A Dry White Season with Donald Sutherland. And the movie is basically about an old South African white gentleman who all of a sudden discovers that apartheid is bad and decides to dedicate his life to ridding South Africa of apartheid, and he becomes this big martyr, and he does all these wonderful things. And she just said, I've lived in South Africa many times. I've studied South Africa extensively, and I find it hard to believe that an elderly South African white man would just then have an epiphany that apartheid was bad. And so it was funny because even in the class, the white girl kind of was quiet, and she agreed with it, and everything was fine. And then there was one brother that was from an area of upstate New York that I was born in Schenectady, and I think he was born nearby. But he decided he wanted to take her up on that, and he said, "Well,
He's a black dude.
He's black, yeah."
Okay.
So he said, "Well, you know what?" He's like, "I think that someone who's white and who they're very sheltered and privileged in South Africa could actually not know that apartheid is bad because they're just so sheltered they don't understand." And she went back and forth with him a few times, and then she had to bring the point that, if you work, there was a store called Woolworths that used to be big in the United States back in the day, and it was big internationally as well. So in South Africa, she made the point that a Woolworths clerk or a cashier who was white had black servants during the time of apartheid. So even people who were cashiers or kind of lower end of the economic spectrum and educational spectrum, but they were white, still had black servants, which tells you kind of how insidious apartheid was. And he still wanted to argue, and we went back and forth for a long period of time, and it was very uncomfortable. And later on that afternoon after the class, I was supposed to meet with Toni Morrison about my midterm paper, and I was nervous as fuck because I hadn't prepared extensively, and it was on Toni Cade Bambara's The Salt Eaters. And so I had to tell her what my paper was going to be about, what my themes were, what I was going to walk her through. And so I was nervous about coming in. I walk into her office, and I sit down, and she's sitting at this big table, her big office table, and I said, so I'm going to do Toni Cade Bambara's The Salt Eaters, and I'm nervous as hell, like stuttering. And she said, hold on a second. And she looked at me and she said, can you believe that motherfucker wanted to argue back and forth with me for that long? And I just stopped and I sat back in my seat and I was like, no, I couldn't. And she was like, had he ever been to South Africa? She went on and on and on. And she said, and he just kept going. And I said, yeah, he did. And then she kind of collected herself and was like, okay, that's fine. So your paper. Let's talk about your paper. But I felt like she almost had to get it out of her system, like to make sure she wasn't crazy, that she didn't experience that by herself. But it also told me, it also was a good example about how people in lofty places, whether they be academics or celebrities, authors, actors, are still real people. They get pissed off at the same shit that everyone else does. And she cursed. When she said, "Can you believe that motherfucker?" I was just like, "Oh my God, Toni Morrison is saying motherfucker," and it's okay. It surprised me, but it made
Toni Morrison says it's okay to do it.
It made her more human to me, and it was just a great experience.
Or maybe it was Chloe.
Right,
Chloe.
Right. So I just think she's amazing. And when I heard about the news the other day, I just kind of stopped, and it seemed like it was yesterday morning, right?
It was yesterday morning.
Well, it was 2 days ago that she died, but they started to announce it, I think, yesterday morning.
Well, I found out yesterday morning.
And I found it yesterday morning, and it almost seemed like the whole world was off its axis yesterday.
Oh, yeah, I was like, today's not going to be a good day.
Like, everything was just going wrong. People were acting crazy. Things weren't
yeah.
happening they were supposed to. Things weren't flowing the way they were supposed to. I just felt like almost at the start of that, like the universe was somehow off. It was just odd.
Yeah, I don't know if there's been a writer in my lifetime that passed away. After I was like reading where it impacted me so deeply.
Right.
And I just felt this sense of regret that I never got to meet her, never see her read from one of her novels. Made me nostalgic. Of course, I have so many memories. And there's been, and not just reading her novels in solitary, but also having community around her books. I remember like one of my greatest memories in college was just, me and my friends discussing the Toni Morrison novels that we loved and being kind of bonding around books. I don't know if that's still a thing where people bond around a love for particular authors, just and being personally offended, appalled if someone dares critique, Toni Morrison. How dare you not?
How could you? Like, she's perfect, right?
She's perfect. How dare you, right? But having so many pleasant memories.
Yeah, and she's got so many great novels. Like, you think about Beloved, which obviously was the one that made the biggest splash, but Song of Solomon, Sula, The Bluest Eye, A Mercy, Paradise, Jazz.
So many jazz.
Yeah, there's so many books that she's written.
And rereading them, and every time, for me personally, like every time I've reread one of her novels, just loving it as much as I did the first time.
Yeah, and I think for me, I was reading a lot of them during high school and college, and then when I came back and tried to read them, like, I actually had read 2 books while I was on vacation earlier this year, and I started to read, and they were both brilliant books. And then when I picked up Song of Solomon, I was like, okay, I really got to be on like I had to be on my shit at that time because I was
ready.
like, this is not something you can just sit on a beach
And just like
be like kind of casually flipping through. Like I had to be on my game to kind of see exactly what was going on with it. I did not see. I was going to mention. Did you see the movie?
Beloved?
The documentary.
I did. What's weird is I saw it about 2 weeks ago, like very recently.
What'd you think?
I loved it. I thought it was. I mean, it was a lot of her interviews, and she was just always so good. I mean, it's Toni.
Yeah, my friend said I saw some friends who saw it and said she looked ill during some of the interviews. Did you notice or did you pick up on any of that?
Well, I mean, as she aged, as she's aged in general, I've noticed that she shows up differently. But I just assumed it was just what happens when you get older. I mean, she was in her late 80s, so I just kind of expected her to be a little. But yeah, I thought it was really great. But I feel like so much of my relationship with Toni is through watching her in interviews and reading. I remember when I was in college, I picked up this book, like Conversations with Toni Morrison, and just reading the interviews. And I think in a sense I was also trying to understand, how does one become a writer and how does one become a thoughtful person and trying to get some insights about politics. But just really, really grateful. Are you feeling like you want to reread Toni Morrison now? Or
I do know I'm going to go back and read Song of Solomon.
We should read it together. Are you going to let me know if you're going to do it, because if you do it, I'll totally do it.
Yeah, I want to do that because I read like 3 chapters and then I got tired because I had read 2 books before that, and then I don't think I was ready
to go back
to kind of dive in the way I wanted to. So I do want to pick it up and read it again. And I do want to read Sula and the Bluest Eye again.
Oh, I love Sula. Sula's like one of my favorite novels to go back to.
Should we talk about the movies that were based on her novels?
Beloved. I actually like the movie Beloved. I don't care what anyone says. I liked Oprah. I liked all of it. I know it's a very divisive, and I liked Beloved. You didn't like it?
I thought it was okay, and that was when Tandy Newton made her splash.
I mean, I think the way she embodied the character, like, it was probably different. At least how I would have imagined it it being translated cinematically wasn't quite how it showed up. I was like, oh, she kind of went super creepy with it.
Right.
But I mean, it's Oprah. It's like, what else do you need from the movie, really? Yeah,
it was okay, but for like such an iconic book, I was kind of like, it wasn't really that good. I think
we should revisit it, because I haven't. Like, I only saw it when it came out back in 98 or something.
Right.
We should probably. Have you seen it in recent?
I haven't seen it recently.
We should revisit it.
That would be a good idea.
I mean, post Django and post 12 Years a Slave.
Can we read the book before?
Are we going to do Song of Solomon, or are we going to do Beloved?
We'll do Song of Solomon, then we can do Beloved.
Are we going to do a whole Toni thing in the fall? Like, I'm dead.
You're like, I'm dead ass serious.
If you do it, I'm totally going to do it.
We can do that.
We should all read it. Like, y'all should read it too. Like, we should all read Song of Solomon and Beloved together, and then we'll watch the movie. But yeah, please share with us your memories of, reading Toni Morrison, or, watching her interviews, or if you ever took a course with her or saw her lecture. Please share your memories.
She was amazing.
So what else? What's any final things that we need to say about Toni before?
No, I just think she was an amazing author. She was an amazing activist. She was unapologetically Black, and didn't feel she needed to explain anything.
Like Black, like they don't make Black folks no more.
Yeah, no, they don't make folk like that anymore. So it's just, she just didn't care. And I also think she was just a master at her craft. And she's an example of someone who obviously had innate talent, but also crafted that talent and was very serious about it. And so to me, she gives me an example of, kind of how we all should be in our respective fields and what we do.
Oh my God, you know what I just thought about? This might be a little controversial. One of the biggest fights I ever got into about a Toni Morrison novel or just Toni Morrison in general, was I had a friend, and he might be watching actually, and he read this essay that argued that Toni Morrison didn't like light-skinned people, or light-skinned men especially, that she had a whole thing about light-skinned men. And we got into this huge argument, and, because I was like, how dare you? Because I was even thinking like, about, I'm just like, you can't say anything bad about her. But it's just like one of those crazy things, like, how can you argue so passionately about a book, but when you care about something, now you're thinking about it too.
Yeah, I'm kind of thinking about it. I was like, did she have something?
Or that she romanticized dark-skinned men over some whole analysis. Of course.
And that's interesting that someone would complain about that, given the dynamic that most of the time the colorism is favoring someone who's lighter skinned and romanticizing lighter, like Tyler Perry movies, those kind of things. Someone would actually complain that someone was actually romanticizing someone darker skinned.
I know. I hope I don't get hate mail from the Kappas or something. But
the light-skinned community will rise up against you.
Yeah, whatever. So we would need to have a conversation about colorism that we need to have. But no,
we
so
do.
there's Soap Pit Church in the Bluest Eye. Like I was thinking about like the characters. I was like, I don't know. I'm still on the fence. I have to think about it some more. But it was just like, I love being so passionate about. And I think Toni Morrison is probably the only author I've ever been that passionate about. Where any critique, like another critique was. In Beloved, I think there was like an essay, maybe it was in Brother to Brother, like an essay arguing that Beloved was homophobic because the men on Sweet Home didn't have sex. They preferred the whole thing about like they wouldn't have sex. That she couldn't imagine that they would be sexual with each other.
Right.
So they,
That's homophobic.
yeah. But
I'm good.
I was mad at that too. I was like, I don't care shit.
That's
Whatever.
right.
I don't
You
even
can't
know.
critique. It's like
Beyond,
the-
which
the
is I'm
Tony
not
Hawk-
advocating.
It's
that.
almost like Beyonce.
Like nobody. Don't start, David. That's fine. I don't wait. Back to Toni Morrison.
Exactly.
So you're offering your final thoughts. So yeah.
Well, I mean, I'm just I'm just sad that she's passed. I feared that she was sick and that stuff was going on, so I hope she rests in power. It was an honor and a privilege and one of the best memories of my life to actually be in a class with her and actually listen to her read from Beloved. So I think I actually may even check out the audiobook if she narrated it of Beloved or Song of Solomon, just to hear her voice and the cadence of it, I think would be phenomenal. So I think I'm going to do that. But rest in peace, Toni.
Rest in peace, Toni. All right, y'all.